Hello and welcome to the IR Digital podcast. I'm Nick Yates. And today we will be discussing the European Union's new General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, due to go live this month. With me, I have IR Global member Colin Smith, who is a partner at London-based law firm Blaser Mills. Colin will break down exactly what GDPR is and who it applies to, highlighting the key changes that businesses should be prepared for. He will also take us through some new obligations for non-EU firms operating inside the EU. Welcome, Colin. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Nick.
So to kick off, we should go back to basics and understand exactly what GDPR is for the benefit of those listeners who are not fully aware of the regulations. So what is GDPR and who does it apply to?
Right, yes, GDPR, or as you say, Nick, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a new set of data protection laws and rules brought in by the EU that comes into force on the 25th of May 2018. And it's really intended to do two things. The first is to harmonize data protection laws across the whole of the European Union. And secondly, to bring those laws up to date so that they're fit for purpose and can cope with the huge advances in technology that have taken place really since these rules were last looked at. And the GDPR seeks to do this in two main ways, and that's really by giving significantly enhanced rights and remedies, first of all to the data protection authorities in each member state, and secondly, to the data subjects themselves, the actual individuals whose personal data is being processed. So thinking about those individuals, it's important to note that the GDPR applies to any business or public body that collects, uses, or stores the personal data of any EU citizen. So we'll see immediately with that definition that, of course, potentially, the GDPR can apply to organizations who are outside the EU, as well as those who are inside.
Yeah, the legislation does feel like a bit of a game changer. Is there anything else like it globally, would you say?
Well, not really, Nick. I mean, obviously, around the world, many jurisdictions do have fairly extensive data protection regulations, but there's nothing that's really got first of all, the geographic scope of GDPR applying right across the EU and practically speaking across the European Economic Area as well. But then also in terms of the scope of those provisions and the depth and the rigor with which, in theory at least, they look as though they're going to be enforced. So no, it's really something quite new for all of us.
Interesting. What are the key changes that businesses should be aware of, in your view, when the legislation comes in later this month?
I mean, the heart of GDPR is really about creating two new mindsets, and the first of these they call data protection by design, and that is the objective of these rules is to get businesses to think of data privacy and security as in terms of risk. So they design their business operations around it, to kind of put it on a par with health and safety laws, I guess would be the best analogy. And the second key principle is this idea of privacy by default, so that the default position is that all personal data must be protected. Now, the way the GDPR does this, it enshrines 6 key principles, which very simply put are, if you're going to process personal data, then first of all, you've got to do it lawfully, fairly, and transparently. Secondly, if you're going to collect it, you've got to be sure that you've got a specific, explicit, and legitimate purpose for doing so. What you collect has got to be adequate, relevant, and limited to what's necessary for that purpose. It's got to be accurate. And if that means you've got to update it when necessary, well, that's all part of the duty. It should be time limited, so you should keep it only as long as is necessary for the purpose you were collecting it for. And finally, you've got to make sure that you've got appropriate security in place for the data, specifically to protect it against unauthorized or unlawful processing, and also, and this is quite important, quite unique in the GDPR, to protect it against accidental loss, destruction, or damage. And obviously, I stress the word accidental there. So those are the general things that have come in. There are all sorts of specific changes that have happened and things to watch out for. I'm just going to highlight two here today in this podcast. The first of those is, I mentioned as one of the 6 principles, if you're going to process data, you've got to have a lawful ground on which to do it. Well, a very common ground that many businesses use, particularly for marketing to consumers, is consent. And in the days before GDPR, that was quite often done with a sort of tick box, opt-out, one-size-fits-all mechanism. That's not going to fly anymore. Consent under the GDPR has got to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. And that means it's got to be a lot more subtle and a lot better thought through than was done in the past. And the second thing I just perhaps draw everybody's attention to is if heaven forbid, if there's a breach of data, a data breach, these now have to be notified to the regulatory authority within 72 hours of you, the controller, becoming aware of the breach. So that's a significant tightening up of what needs to happen there with data breaches. As I say, there's many other changes, but for today, I'll just highlight those two.
Yeah, well, a lot to think about there. Enough, I think. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, GDPR will influence a huge number of people, but I wondered how it will specifically impact corporations outside of the EU.
Yes, I think. Thanks, Nick. I think there's a number of ways in which this might apply. I mean, the first one to think about is if your organization is based outside the EU and you want to target your services or marketing specifically at citizens inside the EU, then you're almost certainly going to need to appoint a GDPR data representative. Now, that's an individual or organization inside the EU who will effectively be your point of contact, both with the regulatory authorities, but also with the data subjects themselves. You can either have a single representative for the whole of the EU, or if you focus and target on a number of different member states, you can have a different representative in each of those states. So that's something new that GDPR has brought in. I mean, the other aspect to think about, I mean, it's really to do with, if data is going to be transferred outside of the EU, then depending on which jurisdiction you're in, you're almost certainly going to need some more paperwork in place than you previously would have needed. So in some jurisdictions, you need specific prescribed contractual clauses that the EU publishes. If you're in the US, you probably won't need that. You're most likely going to be covered by Privacy Shield, but that doesn't mean you don't need anything at all. If you're a large group, if you've got some divisions, some companies inside and some outside the EU, then you may be able to deal with sending data around the group by using what are known as binding corporate rules. So there's all sorts of different ways in which the GDPR might affect you. If you're outside, but in any way you're wanting to deal with personal data inside the EU, there's almost certainly something for you to think about here.
Okay, thanks, Colin. And one important question we should ask is, what are the consequences of non-compliance with GDPR? Are fines or other punishments possible?
Yes, indeed, Nick. This is one of the biggest changes that GDPR has brought about. I'll deal with fines first of all. Goodness me, yes, this is quite a difference. For a serious breach of the GDPR, a failure to comply with one of the core principles, or with the exercise of data subject rights, or in connection with transferring data outside of the EU, there's a maximum fine of 20 million euros, or 4% of your organization's global turnover, whichever is the bigger. So this is a pretty hefty penalty if things go wrong. Yeah. For even an ordinary breach, any breach of the GDPR, potentially there's a maximum fine of 10 million euros or 2% of global turnover. So, this really is something to take seriously. And of course, in addition to the fines, there's a lot of publicity about GDPR, about data protection in general all over the EU. Don't forget that the data subjects have got enhanced rights as well. So, organizations are potentially open, to all kinds of civil actions, from individuals who perhaps feel their data is being misused. So a lot to get your head around there.
Yeah. Given the seriousness of those fines, I guess we should ask how Blaser Mills is helping businesses prepare for GDPR. I know, for example, that you have a specific service aimed at companies without an EU presence.
We do indeed. So we can be the GDPR representative for any overseas company that needs that position within the EU. We can obviously undertake full GDPR analysis, advise whatever's needed in terms of what your plans are for data inside the EU. For any organization, whether they're outside or inside, we can provide any part of the GDPR service that might be needed. To go to one end of the spectrum, that might be a full data flow assessment and audit, leading then on to a gap analysis that would identify high-risk areas and what remedial action you might need to take. Now, if that's something you've handled internally, you feel is all under control, we can also come in on the end of that and specifically advise you in terms of the documentation that you need, the procedures, the policies, the contractual provisions that you would then put into place to ensure compliance. And then on an ongoing basis, if there are difficulties with managing data breaches in the future, we've got a specific team here who can react very, very swiftly to help organizations deal with such problems. You'll remember the 72-hour reporting requirement. We're very mindful of that, and we've got the flexibility to deal with those sorts of timings.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that interesting insight, Colin. Listeners who wish to learn more about GDPR can find further details on the Blaser Mills website at www.blasermills.co.uk. The next IR Digital podcast in the series will focus on the rise of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, incorporating expert insight from US member firm Park and DeBadge. You can find more information about the podcast series at www.irglobal.com.